This is Rock and Roll English. Real people, real English. Here's your host, Martin Johnston.
Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Rock and Roll English. Episode number 152, baby. Oh yeah, and it is another episode in the Expert Secrets series. Although it is a little bit different today because this time I speak to Keith from IELTS Speaking Success. And remember, if you don't know what the IELTS exam is, it's probably the most famous, the most recognised English exam that there is. People use it to go to university, to move to different countries and stuff like this. And Keith gives us some tips about the speaking part of the IELTS exam. But the advice he gives and the exercises are great ways to improve your speaking in general. So it's definitely worth a listen. One other thing to mention is that Keith, as he was an IELTS examiner in the past, he recently gave me the test. He made me do the test, the speaking part, obviously. And I was very nervous about it. I don't know why, because obviously English is my first language. I don't really have any difficulty speaking English, but I was very nervous. And it was a great experience. And the best thing is, you can watch a video of this. You can watch me shit my pants as I'm responding to the questions. And Keith has also made an analysis of some of the language I use, so you will also learn some new terms. So that will be on the show notes page. So if you go to Rock and Roll English episode 152, you will find the link to my IELTS test there. Anyway, here is my conversation with Keith. I will speak to you all again at the end. Happy listening. So, hello Keith and welcome to Rock and Roll English.
Hello Martin, great to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thanks for coming on. So, tell us about you, Keith. We had a quick conversation before, but the listeners obviously didn't hear that. So, tell us something about you.
So, my name is Keith O'Hare. I come from Manchester originally in England. And I've spent, I guess, the last 20 years in education, being an English teacher, a teacher trainer. I was an IELTS examiner for 6 years when I was in China. And I've kind of worked in different countries. And the last year or two, I've come to Spain and I live here. And I now focus on online teaching and running online courses. And I have a website focused on IELTS, helping IELTS students with their preparation, especially for IELTS speaking. And so it's called IELTS Speaking Success.
Fantastic. And we are talking about IELTS speaking today. What a coincidence that is, hey?
It is funny how things move like that.
It's incredible, isn't it? But it's great to know that you have so much experience. That's what we love on Rock and Roll English. Getting people from all around the world with lots of experience to share with us. But we want to pick your brains today, which is some rock and roll vocabulary, to say, take the knowledge from your brains. Well, brain, you only have one, I think.
To
take the knowledge
sometimes.
To take the knowledge from your brain about IELTS speaking, okay? So what's the main tips that you can give us?
Right. For people preparing IELTS speaking, so I think a good idea is to follow the kind of the 80-20 rule. You may have heard of the 80-20 rule.
Yeah.
But applying it to IELTS and IELTS speaking is, I think, you spend about 80% of your time focused on improving your English, your general English, and only 20% of the time preparing for the exam, doing exam practice and really kind of repeating the exam questions. And the reason for that is I think sometimes people get a bit wrapped up in the questions and memorized answers. I mean, having been an examiner, I think about half of the answers I hear are memorized.
Oh, really? Because I know you get severely punished for that, no?
Severely punished.
Yeah, yes. Well, I think you get like a 1 or something like that.
You get marked down. You don't get a 1, no, but you do. You lose marks on your vocabulary.
Okay.
Because it's memorized, it's kind of put aside. So you'll lose areas of vocabulary. You'll lose areas of fluency because you're not when you go into memorization mode, you're not speaking fluently.
Of course.
And it just has a really bad impact and makes a bad impression on the examiner. So to avoid memorized answers, I think the key is to focus more on just your general English, on being able to speak English to the level you need. And then, of course, yes, you need to prepare the questions, you need to know the format of the exam, and you need to understand the evaluation. So what exactly is the examiner looking for?
Yeah, exactly. This was my next part. So we have fluency and coherence, grammar, grammar, let's just call it grammar.
Range of
grammatical
grammar, I think
range,
they call it.
Range of grammar, okay. Lexical resource and pronunciation, is that right?
That's right. Those are the 4 areas that the examiners are looking for, and they're all equal weighted. So it's kind of 25% each, so to speak.
And as I mentioned in the introduction to the show, Keith actually just gave me the IELTS test, and I had a bit of difficulty, I must admit, especially with the lexical resource, because I was trying to slip in all of these pieces of rock and roll vocabulary, which was confusing me a little bit, because thinking about the vocabulary I was using, I was kind of losing track of what I was saying. So what advice do you give to students for each of these?
Well, let's talk about lexical resource or vocabulary, because I think with vocabulary it's a real difficult balance, because yes, you need to try and use more advanced vocabulary, but you don't want to distract yourself and get too focused on it. So I think my advice is, when you're preparing, to learn vocabulary that is maybe just a little bit beyond your level. So not really complex, that you don't understand or you don't really know how to use it, but language that is a bit above your level, that you have seen how to use it and you feel confident you can use it. And then in the exam, you can use that kind of language. The trouble is, if you're, say, a band 6 and you try and use band 9 vocabulary, it just sounds wrong, because the chances are you're using it incorrectly and in the wrong context. So try and kind of build your vocabulary up just above your level, kind of your level +1, if you like.
Okay.
And I think that's the way to go.
Yeah, that's great. One thing I mention to students when I'm helping them prepare for the IELTS exam is, often it only takes one piece of really good vocabulary, and that often really sticks in the mind. Certainly for me, if I speak to someone and like a person that's learning English as a second language, and they just use maybe one phrasal verb, one kind of idiom, I think, oh wow, just that one thing sticks in your mind. Is that how it is for an examiner, that even if they just say one or two things, so the vocabulary is good and they just have one or two things that they use perfectly, do they stick in your mind when you're having to give the mark?
I think that is a really good point. I think because we are human, then yes, the answer is probably yes, that does happen, that you hear something and go, oh, that's quite good. At the same time, the examiners are trained, and once they've heard that, they'll be listening out to see if you can do it again. Can you impress me again? And if you don't, then it's not as good. But if you can pull it off 2 or 3 times in the test with some really nice, what we call less common idiomatic expressions.
I call it rock and roll vocabulary, but yeah, it's the same.
Yeah, absolutely. Rock and roll vocabulary.
Yeah.
I mean, here's an example, right? In your test, you use the expression flick through. I flick through something, and I think you're flicking through the music in your iPad, and that was great. And I thought, oh, that's really good. That's high level vocabulary. That's good. And then in this later, and this is the point though, later on, you used it again in part 3, and it was okay. But if you had used it 3 times, I would have started to think, hang on, he's just learned this one fancy expression and trying to use it. So fortunately, you only used it twice. So again, the tip is, if you learn this vocabulary, don't use it more than twice in the one test.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. That I just prepared for the test, and I just learnt that one piece of vocabulary. So
Rock and roll.
I'm glad I only used it twice. You made an interesting point, though, of when you said, like, we are humans, like examiners, because this is what I tell students as well, is basically to try and influence them in a positive way, because, you know, we are humans, they can be influenced. For example, I always make the example in the listening and the reading, the answer is right or wrong. There's no, it's not an opinion or anything like that. It's just right or wrong. So how much do you think examiners are influenced?
Wow.
Just with like the way people present themselves and with various different things. And I said, even with this like vocabulary, is it obviously not, they won't be completely influenced, but do you think it's even possible a little bit?
I would say a little bit. Yeah, a little bit. Not a huge amount, partly because in a typical day, you know, we used to see 20 candidates.
Sure.
And if the trouble is, if a candidate tries too hard to make a good impression, you can notice it. So you may get a candidate trying to smile a bit too much, who's dressed up and put lots of makeup on, who's shaking your hand vigorously, who's making so much eye contact, and you start thinking, wow, that they're taking this a bit too far, and you can notice it. So I think it's a good point and something to have in your mind as a candidate, but don't spend too much time on that.
Of course. And I think what it comes down to is just basically being natural. You don't want to, in everything, the way you speak, the way you present yourself in every way. If you try too much at anything, then it just becomes obvious. But so what about other parts of the exam? So we looked at the lexical resource. What about fluency and coherence, pronunciation, grammar? Have you got any tips for any of those?
Yeah, so for fluency, I think this is probably the bit that is most difficult for people because pronunciation, you know, from a beginner to intermediate, you may affect or change your pronunciation. But once you've got to kind of intermediate, it's hard to make a big difference to your pronunciation. But fluency, you can change and you can improve, and you can get the kind of the threshold of that band 7 is where your fluency is without effort. You're speaking without any effort. Anything below that, where you can notice the effort, then it's below a band 7. So I think for students to practice, well, the first thing, practice speaking as much as possible. And by that, I don't just mean in the class with your teacher and practicing exam questions, but just more natural practicing English, whatever it may be, so that you're in a situation where you've got to respond to something, you're not quite sure what's happening, and you're learning to process language more quickly as you speak. That there's a technique called shadowing, which is really good. And I often recommend it to my listeners, but just tell them again, just so it really hits home. So you listen to, for example, an audio recording, maybe 30 seconds. And as you listen... Something like Rock and Roll English. Like Rock and Roll English podcasts. Any one of those would be fantastic. And as you're listening, you try and repeat at the same time. You're almost a second behind, but you're trying to hear, listen, and speak at the same time. And it's a bit like simultaneous translation, but you're in the same language. So you hear English and you speak English. And what it does is it trains you to really pick up on intonation, pronunciation, and processing of chunks of language. And it's very, very powerful. I mean, I've had students do it for 5 or 6 days and already notice a difference. Oh, wow. So you just recommend that they do it with 30-second like chunks of the recording? From personal experience, because I did this with Chinese. I used to listen to Chinese and do it. And to be honest, after 30 seconds, I was exhausted. The mental concentration is really hard. It is really difficult. I do it with Italian even now. And I do struggle because, like you said, it is very exhausting. So maybe do kind of 30-second blocks and have a little break and then come back to it. Sure, that's great advice. So what about part 2 of the exam, which is quite difficult? Again, when we just did that test,
I found that difficult. And the main thing is, which I tell students, and the reason I tell them that they need to prepare for this is because it's so unnatural of just like, even if you speak to someone in their native language, which is what we just did, obviously English is my native language, I still found that difficult of someone just saying talk.
Yeah.
So what tips, just so people know actually, if you're not familiar with it, in the part 2 of the IELTS exam, you're given a card basically, and you're asked to talk about a topic. You get 1 minute to prepare, and then you speak for 1 to 2 minutes about it, which is very strange because it's not a conversation, it's just you talking, like a monologue. So what tips do you give students for that?
First of all, make the most of the 1 minute preparation time. So really use that and try and use it, A, to get your idea, and B, to structure it. So have a clear idea, if possible, about what you're going to talk about, and then try and get some structure, what you're going to say generally about it, what details will come up. You may want to think about, you may want to follow the bullet points. They do give you 3 bullet points, which are actually really good for structure. Typically, like who was the person, when did it happen, what happened, and how did you feel about it.
But just to be clear, because I think there's some confusion here, because some students think that it's absolutely necessary to talk about those.
No.
They're just they're just there for guidance.
Absolutely.
If I'm not mistaken.
You're absolutely right. They're there for guidance. You do not have to follow the bullet points.
Yeah.
You have to talk about the topic. So describe. What did you describe? Describe a singer or a group that you like. So you must talk about that, but you don't have to follow the bullet points. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
So they're there as a guide. It says you should say. It doesn't say you must say. So it's just a recommendation. So think about the structure. I kind of advise students to talk generally for about a minute, and then make sure they have some details. So some details and some examples, because the examiner's looking for your ability to go from a general idea to a detail. And that's also where you're going to produce more interesting language from speaking. Generally, people do this and people do that. And one example is when this happened, different kind of language comes out. So, have general things and a detail.
Sure.
And
that's great advice.
I think maybe also practice doing this at home for 2 minutes, so that you're used to the length of 2 minutes. Because some candidates clearly don't really know how long 2 minutes is, and they stop speaking after 40 seconds, thinking that they finished. So do practice 3 or 4 times at least, actually timing yourself, record yourself, and see how long 2 minutes takes. And listen back to your recording and just notice, I could do that better. I could structure this a bit better. Yeah,
that's exactly what I tell students, because it's the one part of the speaking exam that you can really practice on your own, because that part of the exam is not a conversation. You can actually just talk to your phone, and there's actually no difference as it would be in the exam. So just having that, just being prepared for this strange thing of just having to talk, and as you said, to know how long 2 minutes is, and then the important thing then to listen back so they can listen to pronunciation. Maybe they notice they're making a few mistakes. That's great advice as well. So the last part of the exam, part 3, because when we just did this, the exam, because I know that you're supposed to talk more generally in part 3.
Yeah.
And I noticed myself giving like personal examples. I was saying, I did this, and I was thinking, oh, shit. So what advice can you give us for part 3?
You need a bit of both. You need to go from the general to the detail. So the part 3 questions are much more about ideas and concepts and abstract ideas.
Yeah, exactly.
So don't start talking about you. Talk So if I say, what's the most popular music in your country? Don't say, well, I like. It's people tend to listen to this, or and then you can go, once you've been general, you can go into give examples. I mean, examples are great. It's okay if they're your examples, but you can also try and have different examples that not about you. Part 1 is very much about you. Part 3 is more general. But again, the examiners focused 90% on your language. And if, even though you're talking about you, if the language you're using is up at your band 7, 8, and 9 level, then that's what you'll get. So don't worry too much about it. You've already got 20 things to worry about in the IELTS exam, so don't worry too much about that.
I was worried that I didn't do very well on part 3. How did I do?
You got a 2. No, that's not true. That's not true.
For a minute, I didn't even know what you were talking about, a 2. A 2 for the speaking. Oh, thanks.
No, you'll have to go and listen to watch the video and find out what Martin really got. No, you did very good. Well. You did well. It was great.
That's good to know. Okay, Keith. So where can people find out more about you?
Well, if they go into the internet and go to www.ieltsspeakingsuccess.com, they can find me there. There's a newsletter if they want to sign up to the newsletter and get a free ebook about the 10 most common mistakes that I've seen as an examiner and how to avoid them. There is a YouTube channel that I have, the same name, IELTS Speaking Success on YouTube. There's lots of videos there. There's lots of sample answers with language analysis, as well as kind of tips and things you can do and don't do. And also Rock and Roll English will be there next week.
Okay, fantastic. All of the links to everything Keith mentioned will be on the show notes to the page anyway. So if you go to Rock and Roll English and find this episode, you will find it all there. Anyway, thanks again for your time, Keith.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. Thanks, Martin.
Also for me. I hope to see you very soon.
Yep, take care.
You too. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay, so thanks again for that, Keith, for coming on. And let's have a look at the main takeaways, the things that he spoke about. I really liked this thing about the 80-20 rule. Concentrate 80% of your time to practice in general English and then 20% of your time to the exam. That's how important it is. People think, I'm preparing for the exam now. I just need to do that. But you still need to work on your general English. And I also liked the fact that he said, learn language just above your level, because as he said, if you're going for these crazy idioms and stuff and you're not really 100% sure, it just sounds strange. So go for vocabulary just above your level, maybe vocabulary that you understand when you read, but you don't really feel very confident using it. So concentrate on that vocabulary and then just build up slowly. The advice he gave us about the shadowing technique was very good as well. I liked how he said just concentrate on 30 seconds because as he said, it is very, very tiring mentally. You don't have to run around or anything, but mentally it is very tiring. But as he said, he has seen the difference in people's speaking after only 5 or 6 days. That is incredible. So remember, if we want a new result, we need a new action. So if you're not happy about your fluency, try this. Try something new to get a new result. Another good point was when he said that the examiner is looking for how you can make a general idea and then move that to detail. And I think this just for speaking in general. If you focus on speaking about particular events, practice in your head. Think about a story, or maybe you tell your friends a story in your native language. You explain a funny incident that happened yesterday. Think, how would I say this in English? How would I describe it? Then any of the vocabulary you're missing to describe that, you can obviously go and find. And then practice by yourself as well. You can talk into a phone. That isn't actually strange. Talking by yourself is a bit strange. If you're just walking down the street talking to yourself, it's a bit strange. But use your phone. Maybe do the 30-second shadowing thing. Just listen to that 30-second part of a recording and then record yourself saying it. Think, am I the same as this person? Is my intonation the same? Is my pronunciation the same? And you can see. Anyway, remember, all of the links to everything we spoke about are on the show notes, episode number 152. So go there and find out more about Keith. And thank you again, Keith, for coming on. I will see you all again on Monday, people. But in the meantime, just keep on rocking, baby.
Thanks so much for listening to Rock and Roll English. For more great content and to stay up to date, visit rockandrollenglish.com and facebook.com/rockandrollenglish. We'll catch you next time.